It is a pleasure for me to welcome you here in this room and in this distinguished session. My name is Jetzkowitz. I'm a sociologist working as the head of the Biodiversity Policy Lab at the Museum of Natural History in Berlin, the Museum für Naturkunde Berlin. As you can see from the title of this session, we are going to discuss a very important question. Who is engaged in citizen science and who could or should be engaged in citizen science? This is what we are going to discuss within the next hours. We have two very distinguished keynote speakers here, Philipp Schrögel and Claudia Goebbel. And we have three additional talks, short talks, pitches, if you want to put it like that, from Rachel Pateman, from Christine Urban and Michael Strähle, and from Stefan Reichmann. After that, we can start to discuss what we heard today, what we learned about answers to the question, who is engaged in citizen science and who could or should be. So, Philip, may I ask you to open the session with your keynote?
Ha. Okay, now I was admitted. You can all see me and that's all working. And then I'm sharing my presentation. Excellent. So now it seems frozen. Can everyone give me a quick feedback if that is working? Because yeah, so can anybody give me a quick feedback, because now I really don't see that the window is working. Okay, excellent. Excellent, excellent, excellent. Thanks a lot. Okay, so we're going to start. We don't have much time and I already lost 30 seconds. So my presentation will be, it's called a keynote, but it has to be in 10 minutes. So I really try to keep it short. Underrepresented audience exclusion factors in science communication. So this means I'm presenting from the perspective of science communication. I'm not originally a citizen science researcher, but I think the perspective still is worthwhile and a lot of the results and insights can be transferred. Secondly, you see it, I put it on the title slide, the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm not going to talk about that. We don't have time to actually make the transition explicit. So I just left it here at the title slide, but already there, Goal 10, reduce inequalities, but there are also other SDGs that relate to equity and participation, discrimination, like gender equality, also quality in education. So let's see. This, my presentation, since it's short, I really had to cut it down. It will be a rather theoretical approach. I want to give you two main thoughts that you leave with, and leave with some 3 or 4 points for the later discussion. You can probably read that yourself, and I guess since you're in this session and probably some of you have read the abstract, I don't need to raise the awareness. You probably already all know that there's some issue and we really have to work on that. Science communication is obviously not reaching all parts of society, and equally, since you're talking about that here, citizen science is not reaching all parts of society. What is the problem with that? Well, the problem is typical science events look like that. If you have typically a Western perspective, mainly highly educated older men, and this is another aspect I want to highlight here. If you look at me, I'll look like that probably 10 to 20 years from now. So I'm somewhat part of the problem, and I don't want to marginalize any perspective of discriminated or marginalized communities. So I'm referring here at the overarching level, trying to pull some thoughts together. And of course, communities themselves have to get active to talk about their individual needs. There's another point I want to highlight. With data, that is not only a normative perspective that, well, everybody should be equally reached by science communication, but they're also really, it's influencing a lot of things. So here there's a survey by Pew Research in the United States. There are various factors that affect how parts of the public view certain issues in science, and have views on especially ethical or political views on regulation of science, or here, for example, genetically modified foods and things like that. So it's worthwhile talking about that. The thing is, you've just seen that here. It's really difficult to talk about excluded groups, and I've called it underserved audiences. But who are these audiences actually are comprised of? And so this is the first major takeaway, and that we developed in our research project, Science for All, that it's better to think about individual exclusion factors rather than about excluded groups, because there are many factors and they are not homogeneous parts of society, not as homogeneous groups that are excluded, but they can contribute, these factors can contribute well together. The intersectionality is the term for that. They can amplify themselves mutually. So it's worth thinking about what contributes to a possible exclusion. In our project, we try to dig deeper into this problem, because it's not only an issue about gender, for example, or racial inequalities, or many other aspects, but there's even much more. We developed a typology of possible exclusion factors based on a systematic literature review. And the thing is, since this is only a 10-minute talk, I'm not going to introduce all of them. Probably you won't even have time to read all of them, but I still want them to show you that there's actually a lot to talk about. We've grouped these factors into 3 layers. Most importantly, although they are called individual factors, social factors, and structural factors, this does not mean that individuals are responsible for addressing their individual exclusion factors. Of course, this is the task of science institutions and organizations to actually work on their discriminating behaviors, their discriminating structures. It's just here in building this typology where these actually come into play. Another thing is, and you can email me afterwards to see this is very complex, and a lot of it's not that easy that it's just 2 or 3 population groups that are not reached. And we say, okay, how do we get this message into the science communication community? And so we decided to actually make the research on inequalities that itself more accessible by trying to take a graphical approach. Say, well, how can we get these complex typologies, and there's a lot of social science behind that, into the community and make it practically available for science communicators? And that's the reason we developed here, it's called some kind of infographic on these exclusion factors that can be used and trigger, hopefully, a reflection and a discussion among science communicators, and makes this typology really useful to be used to question and improve science communication practices. So I think a lot of these are equally valid for citizen science, and we can come back to that later in the discussion. I think a lot of people who are actually talking from citizen science projects can talk from their real hands-on experience within the projects, if that's the case, and what their experiences are with their audiences they're reaching, they're not reaching. Because when we see, and that's the point why I think it's also important to talk about citizen science, of course, there's also research about the audiences of citizen science projects, or the participants in citizen science projects. And of course, also, it's really difficult to measure things that you cannot measure, like who is not there. Of course, you can only question people who are there, and then have to deductively think about who then is left out when you're comparing that to the whole population. And a lot of these surveys about participants in citizen science projects also focus on these very classical categories. This is from these National Academies of Engineering and Science consensus study report. And see, I've just highlighted two major factors, that college degree and the traditional Western Caucasian background. There's an abundance of these people in citizen science projects, and you don't really see from those who are not or less represented, there's much more to that than these few categories that are depicted there. So I think this is the first takeaway. It would be important to have a broader view on non-participation also in citizen science, and not focus on these main and also more easily accessible categories that you can ask in surveys. A second part, and it's also a theoretical consideration I want to share with you, is, and it's developed from my work from science communication to open science, that it maybe would be better to think about access and accessibility rather than just openness. So to stay in this picture here, of course, if you want to have someone to have access to a building, it's nice if that door would be open, but it's still the question who goes through that door. Is it inviting? Are you asked to come in? Is there barriers because you see steps there? So there are a lot of things that can be open but are still not accessed by various parts of society. So access and accessibility might provide a better perspective. And to back that theoretically, it comes back to the philosophical discussion about negative freedom versus positive freedom. The typical views on barriers in science are defined around a negative understanding of freedom, meaning freedom is the absence of barriers. So they're negative, there are no barriers. But then it's still the question if people still can use of this freedom. So this would be the positive freedom understanding. Say, can you really actively engage in things, actively go through this door? So really a change in mindsets, not talk about open science, but accessible science, and see if that can contribute to making things actually more accessed than in the final consequence. And last, I have four thoughts for the later discussion. And as I said, I come from the perspective of science communication. And I'm really looking forward to discuss that with the people that will present insights from their actual research and their actual practical experience within citizen science projects. But 4 quick points. Which role does citizen science actually play for promoting equity and/or knowledge equity in comparison to science communication formats? In our practical approaches in the project, we encountered something we called the openness paradox. Of course, the idea is, and we later hear that about the democratization of science and make everything open and participatory, and then people will join, but it has a lot of requirements to actively participate in a project. So sometimes it's easier to have a format where you can, for the first step, just listen, try something, and if you develop interest later on, maybe also start actively participating. But people who haven't engaged with science at all, it's a real high barrier to ask them from the beginning on, okay, now you have to take data, you have to develop your own research question because that's what you need for your empowerment. So maybe you need smaller steps to go there. The second, and of course, it's a rather rhetorical or hypothetical question. Citizen science and science communication projects, and probably I'm going to answer it because it's kind of stupid. They, of course, cannot solve all underlying societal institutional marginalizations. If you have parts of the population that are discriminated against in the whole school system, in the job market, in the educational system, this is not solved with one nice citizen science project or one nice inclusive and diverse citizen science communication brochure. So really, you have to deal with these whole surroundings, and also the question, what tasks do you burden yourself as the goal for your project with? Third part, we're talking about the Sustainable Development Goals on a global perspective. And of course, in science, there's a lot of global inequality, but the question is, how do you address that? Or do you address local inequities? Or is there some kind of balance where you set priorities? And the same would be the fourth question. Do you really need this broader perspective on everything and try to solve every tiny detail, or rather start with some prioritization and then from there on work to the width? We've identified 31 exclusion factors, and of course you cannot solve all of them at once. You have to start somewhere. So where do you start? What would be most important? What is most urgent? What is the largest group? So really, I think it would be good to have a discussion on that. So these would be the 2 major parts. Think about a broad width of factors and their intersectioning. And second, think about accessibility instead of openness. And with that, I'm concluding this very short input, and also would like to thank our project partners and funders who made this research and project possible.
So, und jetzt höre ich wieder nichts.
We are not hearing anything, Jens.
Click it again, click again. Okay, thank you, Philip. Thank you very much for your talk. I think we're coming back to your talk, to the contents of your talk, and to your important questions at the end of the talk in the panel discussion. So our second keynote is from Claudia Goebbel. Claudia, the floor is yours.
Hear me too? I hope so, because I can't see you anymore on screen. If not, then maybe you with computers could let us know. Thank you very much for the opportunity to give a presentation here in this session. This is really, really great opportunity. I would like to talk about inclusion and exclusion in citizen science from an infrastructure perspective. And this is because this whole conference is looking at knowledge for change and what is the role that citizen science can play for that. And I believe if we want to create transformative knowledge, then we also need to change the ways in which we produce that knowledge. And here citizen science is advocating for change, and it carries a lot of these promises that we can make knowledge production more open, more participatory. We can create better knowledge and bring in issues from society really to the core of research. But I think here is where we need to look closer, and this links very, very well to Philip's presentation and the second point that he addressed in the big questions. We are facing huge inequities in society at large, but also in how our scientific systems operate. Not all forms of knowledge, types of data or perspectives are represented equally or in a way that how they should be. You can see here, it's a graphic of scientific papers published in the year 2015. And the country where I live and work is quite large there. I wonder, what about yours? This is a global conference. Where do we find Eastern Europe, for example, or what is happening on the African continent? We also could think of genomic data or data on health research and the knowledge that the creation of cures and vaccines is based on. Here we find a high underrepresentation of female perspectives as well as people of color. So these are the inequities that we already have, and to this comes that we are facing transformations at a societal level that citizen science is part of, to which not all people have the possibility to contribute and to benefit from in the same ways. This is true for shaping digitalization in the ways our organizations work. So we should be very mindful of this and need to address this in order not to reproduce or to even aggravate the tensions, the inequities and inequalities that we have have in our societies today. And we know that this is a lot of work still to be done. There's a recent study of Sascha Dickel and Andreas Wenninger, and they look at citizen science and they find that citizen science is basically reproducing normal science. So there's not so much very crazy transformative stuff happening. It is, but it's still not in the mainstream. So this is, against this background, is where inclusion is interesting to me. Especially right now that citizen science and the whole forming of these communities, not the structures, are in an early phase. I think it's very important who is part of these communities of practice and who is shaping what openness and what participation mean. And here is where I would like to go beyond the level of individual people participating in citizen science projects or in science communication and look more at the infrastructure. So imagine you stand here and you have a bike. Where do you go? So this is where we can have a different way of looking at these issues and also ask ourselves, what structures are we actually building to build these citizen science communities? And here again, I think it's important that we are in very early stages of coming together as citizen science and participatory research practitioners, because there's a lot of flexibility still in these systems. So we can pave the roads that we want to pave. And still, in other systems, it's never too late for a change. The other day, I was riding my bike at Friedrichstraße, and all of a sudden, I popped in, and there was this two-way bike lane, and it was really just a marvelous feeling. I had to get off and take a picture, and just 10 minutes of riding there in joy and getting really a different experience of what inner city life can actually be like. So. We can take this in mind. And with that, I would like to share some instances of the work that I've been doing in the past years on how we can shape these infrastructures for citizen science. And a first topic I want to look at is what issues are we actually addressing through citizen science? Where do they come from? There is this promise that we can have problems that university research has never seen before, and we really take the issues from civil society into the heart of research. And I believe that while working with individual people and citizens can work for that. Another thing that has been done for many, many years is to work with civil society organizations as such, because they already bundle interests of people on the ground. So community organizations or different types of NGOs. And we actually find that this is very common practice in traditional participatory research. We have that in amateur naturalist research, but also in Wittenberg at the Institute of Higher Educational Research, we are just conducting a study on citizen science and the social sciences and humanities. And there we also find that in half of the projects that we look at, civil society organizations are engaged. So this is, it's a large number, and also there's a different book project that I'm involved in, where with two other authors we are looking at how civil society organizations that grow out of protest movements are really key in generation of transformative knowledge, because they take this knowledge which is marginalized from policy and research processes and bring this in and make it workable for research processes. So we know that, however, in the general citizen science discourse, civil society organizations, they do not play a huge role. If you look at the articles at Citizen Science Theory and Practice, you find a little bit on it, but it's still on the sidelines. And most of all is the policies, the measures that we create to support citizen science, they are very much geared towards supporting research institutes to lead those projects. And this is something that is really key. What can we do here? I think there are two things. Bring practitioners together to exchange on what could work to have more civil society participation. and also do more research. On the first one, there are several working groups that we have, and if I'm lucky, I can talk about it in a little bit. And one is on inclusion and equity in citizen science. And there, at a recent meeting, Anita Shervington from Blastfest in the UK, she was just putting out this thought: how would public engagement with research look like if the funding for such projects would not go to the researchers, but to community organizations? Just imagine how this whole landscape would work. We also did a workshop in Paris together with the Alice Association. They're really drawing out and looking at different factors of how funding for citizen science and participatory research would need to change in order to be more open and accessible for civil society organizations. And last but not least, tonight we are going to have an evening event that looks particularly at civil society perspectives in citizen social science. So please be our guest from 7 to 9 and find out more. Finally, there's also research. I mentioned the Soces project in which I work, where we investigate social sciences and humanities, and there we also try to find out more about the participation of civil society organizations. A second issue is to look at the voices that shape citizen science communities and organizations. And I believe that a very prominent way for coming together in these communities is to have events like ours today, maybe, where the community comes and shapes what is actually the core of knowledge. How do we interact? And here, if you look broader, not only at this one today, you find that those conferences there are very much modeled after scientific and policy events. And the main target audience is professional researchers or people who are coming in a professional capacity. So here, what we have done in the past in the project Doing It Together Science is to look at how civil society organizations, again, could be more invited and have more active roles in these events. For example, it's really the simple things then, but it comes down to what day of the week you hold the events, but also to such things as what kind of keynotes do you have, and do you encourage to have different perspectives, maybe one from a researcher and one from a civil society perspective. And another one that I would like to highlight is there was recently the conference of the European Citizen Science Association, and there we really have proposed with a working group a set of inclusion measures, and one was to have a safe space policy for the first time, and a team of safe space supporters to really see how we interact at this conference. We could also think, where are the citizen scientists? How do we want them engaged in this community? Or also special interest organizations. Maybe we would like to work more with them. Key to all of this would be the third point, that is having communities of practice that are diverse and linking citizen science to neighboring communities, for example, of community-based research or participatory action research, and also more data-driven variants, looking also at other communities from open science infrastructures. And with that, I really hope that I could point out a little bit how an infrastructure perspectives on inclusion and exclusion in citizen science can give us some new ideas of also looking at the organizations, the policies, and the networks that are at the basis of citizen science and that we are shaping in these days. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Claudia, for this inspiring talk and for the hint for the evening session you're preparing for this conference. We now step directly into the short talks. Rachel, can you hear me, and can you share your screen with us? Hi, Rachel.
Hi.
Rachel gives a short talk on participation in citizen science and the SDGs in low and middle income country cities. Jan, can you double click on Rachel's screen share so that we can see her slides here? Okay. Okay, the floor is yours, Rachel.
Okay, and you can hear me okay? Yeah, okay. So thank you for the opportunity to give a brief talk today. I'd like to briefly give some very short views on why diverse participation is important in the context of the SDGs. So first of all, citizen science has been discussed as a way that we can fill data gaps that exist in national SDG monitoring data, and also to provide local information to add richness and nuance to national level monitoring. But that's only going to be achieved if citizen science itself is inclusive of all sectors of society. And we know, for example, in high-income countries that this is not the case. And in fact, it's the marginalised that are typically excluded from citizen science participation. And I just at the moment, at the last minute here, have thrown in this figure in response to Philip's talk, because in fact, we currently have a paper under review which has looked at a cross-section of the population in Great Britain, and we asked about 8,000 people if they had participated or not participated in environmental citizen science. And that large sample size allowed us to look at interactions between different demographic groups. And so we find some patterns like, so we expect that people from minority ethnic groups and women are less likely to participate than those from white ethnic groups and men, but we find that that distinction, that difference is particularly acute in women from minority ethnic groups, so they're particularly unlikely to participate. And there's some other interesting patterns that emerge. So we see quite high levels of participation in minority ethnic groups, in younger age groups, as well as white ethnic groups. But what we don't see in the minority ethnic groups is this increase in participation in people from older age groups, which we do see in those white groups. So I just thought I'd throw that in because that was a useful, interesting addition to Philip's talk. But back to citizen science and the SDGs. Citizen science has also been discussed as a way to implement or achieve the SDGs. And again, that's going to be problematic if certain groups are excluded. So poor decisions may be made if data that they're based on are not representative of all sectors of society, and this could lead to solutions being developed that only work for a narrow group of people. And a lot of the way that the SDGs is going to be achieved or implemented is at a local level, and if certain groups are excluded from local participation, and they're obviously going to be excluded from those benefits as well. And then also citizens who don't have the opportunity to participate will also be excluded from the potential individual benefits of participation, for example, learning about sustainability, gaining skills which could lead to employment, and using these knowledge and skills to inform their personal decision making or to influence other decision making. So the second thing I'd just like to talk about briefly is a review that we've just done on past and current citizen science projects in lower middle income countries. And we've decided to focus on those environments, so urban environments in lower middle income countries, as they've been kind of dubbed as the locations in which the battle for sustainability will be won or lost. So this is just a kind of snippet of what we've done in this analysis, but we've looked at the countries in which we find citizen science projects. And we find the most projects are in upper middle income countries and by far the fewest in low income countries. We also find a huge number of projects in China, so it's interesting to think about what's facilitated that there. And we've also, as part of this analysis, done some looking at what lessons have been learned from project leaders in terms of engaging participants within projects, and a lot of that comes back to lessons that have been learned in terms of engaging typically marginalised groups. So some kind of practical lessons that have come out of those analyses have been making sure that you have the time to build trust and relationships with participants. And this comes back to what Claudia was saying in terms of engaging the right partners. So this is a common theme that we came back to, is using those civil society organisations as a route into community engagement. to understand potential participants' motivations in order that they want to participate in projects, and to co-design methods and materials to ensure that they're appropriate. And that's particularly important when working with the poor, because we need to design things that they can do that are not going to place any extra burden on their daily lives. And also to be aware of digital exclusion and to think about different methods of engagement within a project. So, I mean, these are things that we're just kind of embarking on thinking about. So I think my kind of key messages are that we need to understand more about who is and who isn't participating across the globe in citizen science, the barriers to citizen science participation in different countries and in different communities, and how we can work to overcome some of these barriers if citizen science is to achieve its potential within the SDGs.
Much for your talk. We directly jump into the next talk. Christine Urban and Michael Strehle are going to talk or are going to raise the question, democratizing science by citizen science, a realistic claim. Michael, please. Somebody has to unmute your mic.
Okay, no, it is. No, it is. Yeah, there's a frequent claim that citizen science leads to a democratization of science. For instance, the European Commission says that citizen science is an ideal means to democratize citizen science, and the European Citizen Science Association says in its mission statement, we want to establish citizen science as a recognized, promoted, and funded approach, one that fosters scientific literacy and the democratization of science. Well, this is a claim we know from all these debates about public engagement since the last 30 years. And probably we can apply the same criticism here to citizen science, because this claim is based on the assumption that participation of citizens easily translates into democratization. The ideal behind this, that true democracy is a participatory or stakeholder democracy. However, as a research project engaging citizens is not necessarily a democratic project. This is an undercomplex understanding of democracy and of modern pluralist societies, because it's not easy to come to a consensus in our societies. So this raises several questions. And so we only want to raise questions for the discussions. What does participation mean here? Does it mean the more I'm involved in a citizen science activity, the more participatory it is? It seems that most citizen science activities are crowdsourcing activities. Are such activities necessarily democratic? Or is the criterion that the more I'm involved in decision making, the more democratic it is? In this respect, participation in science policy and community-based research are mentioned as examples. Then, who participates in such activities? And I'm glad that Rachel did research on this, because up to now it was rarely known who really participates in such activities. Participation in research can favor those with more resources of time, skills, better technical equipment, and so on. In short, those who are already cumulatively advantaged. So one could say pigeons flock to where pigeons are. And Stefan will later present something on Matthew effects in citizen science, and that's exactly what we are pointing to. In the case of citizen engagement in science policy, there remain questions. how accessible and transparent these formats are, who is targeted, who frames the issue, how top-down are seemingly bottom-up approaches, who considers them as truly democratic. So we know from research on public engagement that mostly those who participate in such formats find them legitimate. So, and then we have these grand challenges, and the grand challenges, they dwarf the mini publics we have here. So then, by claiming that citizen science democratizes research, citizen science is considerably morally charged. And Imre Lakatos said that theories need a kind of protective belt. So we could also say that that the claim that citizen science democratizes science is such a protective belt, such a protection belt, and maybe a protection belt against critical criticism of citizen science approaches. So the question remains, how would or could our understanding of citizen science change if we do not use this protective belt, if we do away with the talk of democratizing science? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael and Christine. So we directly step to Stefan's short talk. Stefan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jens. I'll try to share my screen.
Okay.
I think it worked. So thank you for this opportunity, Jens. My name is Stefan, and I come from a slightly different perspective. So I come from open science, actually. And today I'll be speaking on behalf of a project called On Merit, Observing and Negating Matthew Effects in the RRI Transition. And our consortium looks at key aspects of RRI and open science, well, at least initially, to understand how maybe instead of ameliorating existing inequalities and making science and research more participatory, both RRI and in general and open science in particular might actually worsen existing inequalities. With respect to RRI in particular, the worry is that because these new forms of participation in research and access to the outputs of research, the outputs of the research process, say in the form of open access to scientific literature, depend on the availability of resources. And this means that, well, at least there's a worry that these new forms of participation might actually benefit those that are already well resourced, right? For the case of academia, at least, this is sort of one of the case studies that we study in On Merit next to industry and policymaking. But for academia, at least, this seems to be a fairly established claim, right? It has been discussed in the 60s already by sociologist Robert Merton, who discovered this sort of dynamic of cumulative advantage in science, a sort of a positive feedback loop with respect to the reputation of academics, right? When you're already well cited, the chances are that you'll be able to gather even more citations and other forms of resources, and that obviously tends to lead to individuals and institutions benefiting disproportionately if they are already rich in resources. So this is what Merton called the Matthew effect. Now the issue that we see with the uptake of RRI practices with this general aim of making research more inclusive seems to be that these too depend on the availability of certain resources. And these resources, for instance, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of political support, but also in terms of material resources, they too seem to be unevenly spread, right? This seems, and I would love to hear Philip's opinion on this, but this seems to be akin to what he called the openness paradox. Now, the work that I do specifically is in the field of policymaking and specifically participatory policymaking, and who has access there, who gets to bring their message across to policymakers. And there, basically, what we try to do is to investigate whether this same dynamic of a Matthew effect, of this positive feedback loop, is at work there as well. Essentially, we try to understand how the outputs of citizen science projects and open science projects are used by policymakers. So, in essence, whether these actually have an impact on policy. And well, in terms of uptake, in terms of research uptake, we found that well, first of all, uptake is not necessarily a linear process, right? So just putting the information out there, which when you listen to open access advocates, at least, is a lot of the time seems to be how this is imagined. Just putting information out there definitely is not enough. Further, when you talk to decision makers themselves, they say, well, actually, what's important to us is the network and that we have and the people that we talk to, not necessarily what's published and what's available in the literature. And this situation seems to be putting an asterisk sort of on the issue of research uptake. So in terms of public participation, and in terms of the outputs of participatory research, the outputs of open science and of citizen science, this seems to mean that even if we manage to make the process of knowledge creation, so the part where knowledge is produced more participatory through citizen science, for reasons that seem to have nothing to do with the participation at the research end, this is not necessarily reflected in public policies, and that's because these processes of uptake, of research uptake, don't necessarily work in the way that proponents of open science, such as myself and proponents of RRI and citizen science, imagine how this works. Thank you. That was it.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Thank you very much, to all of you. Claudia, would you join us here or join me here on stage? Any comments, any questions to our distinguished speakers here? I can raise a question which was sent in the chat room from Henry. It's more a comment as far as I can see. I just read it so that even the colleagues here in the audience can see it. It looks like there is strong evidence that participation is not always representative. But do we know how much that matters? Do different types of people produce different kinds of data and results? Perhaps not. For example, when collecting data on birds. In other contexts, this may really matter. For example, for social science projects. And obviously, when it is about citizen learning. Colleagues, does anyone want to respond to Henry's comment? Rachel?
Yeah, I think hear myself. Yeah, it's something that we obviously, and I think we need to consider what the wide implications might be in kind of biodiversity data-driven projects that we might not necessarily think initially there would be an impact on the data of who is participating, but we know, for example, that there are correlations between environmental quality and deprivation, for example. And so it depends where if your project's asking people to investigate their local area and you're excluding marginalized groups from that data collection, then that might actually have an impact on the data you're collecting. But that's just a kind of a hypothesis and something that needs to be looked at further.
So, jetzt her nichts mehr.
Jens, we can hear your audio here in the online stream.
Well, there is a different question another question from Miguel. I'm a citizen science practitioner, but also a professional environmental scientist. I've been trying to engage researchers in a citizen science practice. However, I have found very limited interest. I understand there might be a lack of proper framework for researchers to take the risk, but unfortunately, my feeling is that many times it is easier to engage people with scientists than good scientists with people. So this is, well, a question to scientists. Philip, perhaps you can comment on this, on Miguel's comment. Why is it so hard for scientists to, well, be open for citizen science projects?
Okay, I try to keep it very short because also I know there are some studies out there about the position and attitudes of scientists towards participation in citizen science overall. But to keep it short, you have to actually put a lot of work and effort into that if you want to do it right. Like what I just told, if you just open with it, say, okay, well, here's my data, we do open data, just do something with it, or here I put my biological specimens out there, you can help me classify them. Of course, you will only attract certain kinds of people and probably no people at all. So if you want to have a successful citizen science project, you need to put work into that, and that costs you time, that costs you financial resources. And a lot of scientists, I would assume, just don't have it on their hand without special projects.
Claudia?
Maybe I can add to that. I would also think, I mean, I spoke before about those policies or the structural level. I think incentive structures or how the research system operates for professional scientists is a part for that. So if we look at how scientific careers work today and who can actually work there and have a job that is for more than maybe 3 years or so, all of these are factors to consider if we look at who even has the possibility to start a citizen science project. Also, if you take into account that it represents huge extra work, like what we found in an earlier study is that also the scientists that participate in the citizen science project, they need to become citizen scientists, because that means working after hours when people have time that you work with, and so on. So it's also a burden for them.
Okay, thank you. Well, I read a comment which is added to the chat by Barbara Mihok. Thanks for the talks. Can exclusion be also a result of the concern of scientific quality assurance when collected by laymen, non-experts, etc.? How can we resolve that? I think this is a question also to citizen scientists. Who has an idea? What can we do? How can we solve this problem? Has anyone an answer?
I could give it a very brief.
I can't hear you.
I could give it a very brief try. You can hear me now? Excellent.
Okay.
So
yeah.
first of all, the question about data quality in citizen science is a big question, like asked from the very beginning on, not only with respect to the exclusion of certain societal groups. So I don't think really that there's a definitive answer. I only would say it's not as big as a problem as some people make it. And second part of the answer would be with respect to exclusion. I think it worsens the problem somehow from the perspective of scientists who are afraid of losing data quality, because for people who are more highly educated, who have the same habitus, like the same way of speaking, it's much more easier to talk with them about the high ideals of good data and building on their prior formal education levels. But I don't see any problem that can't be solved there. So I don't think it's that big of an issue. You just have to do it and put some effort into that, again, as previously.
And maybe to build on that, I think the question is if we, so I think it still mixes up different points. So one thing is that, of course, research needs to rely on quality standards. Yeah, this is, for me, as part of the definition of science. So then we look at how this was achieved in the past very often, and is still very much achieved, is by having a boundary around science and having certain education for people who want to be doing this professionally, and then they have knowledge on how to ensure quality. Then there is a peer review system, and this is how do we ensure as a community of researchers to do good science. Now this is open for the participation of non-professional researchers. So I think the question, if opening or not, or excluding in that case, is not the issue. I guess the question would more be, so if we open now, what measures do we have for quality assurance? And there is a lot of work done with educational material, training courses, then a lot of projects also solve this through technology. So it's not even very open. If you look at how contributions can be made in those big digital projects, then you do not have a lot of leeway for committing errors. They already try to train you in such a way. Then there is statistical procedures for calculating errors and rerunning data gathering of trials with people. And so this is already in place, and here I believe the researchers are very much at the forefront of designing these procedures because they have this knowledge. And one of the aspects that I was focusing on earlier in my talk is to say, okay, wait, there are also other communities of practice that have been doing participatory research for quite some time. So maybe we can also learn something from that. So community-based participatory research, for example, looks very much at environmental health problems and so on. And they have knowledge on working with civil society organizations or citizen groups. Whereas the citizen science projects that are now very big and make up most of this citizen science landscape, there are very much, there's a lot of expertise in terms of data quality and those statistical procedures. And one of the ideas we have in this working group that we have at the European Citizen Science Association is to bring these communities together to exchange on these methodologies, really, and so to create the new quality standards that we need to do more open and participatory research.
Well, thank you. I think we have time, I hope we have time for a final question. I pick out a question from Tina at Rachel. How can you adapt your citizen science project to include the poor who have other priorities? Basic needs like food or shelter. Do you have good examples from that, e.g. from the Global South? I think this is a very important question, especially if we keep in mind what Claudia addressed, the inequality aspects Claudia addressed in her talk. Rachel, can you give us a short answer to Tina's question.
Yeah, and I think that was one of the key things that came out of the review that we did, was this tension between community needs, what would suit a community, and the need that if you're going to engage the very poor, that these projects really need to be designed, co-designed with them to be something that they really need and are invested in, and are designed so that they're suited to their daily lives. How you marry that with a kind of top-down, we want this monitoring data to inform this national monitoring, there's a huge tension there, and that's something that needs a lot of exploration as to if you can marry those together, if it's desirable to do so.
Well, there is a bell ringing here in the room, which reminds me that, well, 1 hour is over. Thank you very much for your inspiring talks. I learned from the comments in the chat room that everybody finds your talks very inspiring. So thank you very much for participating here, and well, a final applause to our colleagues, I think, here in the room would be very kind.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.